We all ready? Good. Excellent. I guess that time will time me down, right? It was really great to be able to meet with you all here this morning. This is my first time to England, so I'm very excited about it. Enjoying it very much. Thank you. Good to have another Aussie in the class too. Make me feel a little bit home. As we begin this particular workshop, let's bow our heads as we start with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the privilege and the honour that it is to be able to spend some time discussing your work, discussing the work that you have called us to, and looking at ways found within your word of being able to reach the people around us. We pray for your blessing upon it, to rest upon us as we do so. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. As I mentioned in the little introduction I did a few minutes ago, Sydney, Australia is about the most secular and postmodern city that you'll find anywhere in Australia. Even though largely Australia is very secular and postmodern, Sydney's probably the extreme of it. It's a city of about 4.5 million people, and about 4 years ago I was asked to be part of a team to plant a church in the very centre of the city. 3 years later we planted our second church in the just outside the centre of the city. That one's now been operating for 1 year, and next year we'll be planting our third just across the other side. And so our aim is to continue to be planting churches at a rate of one new one every 2 years, God willing. When we come to consider the society in which we live, and I tend to think that England is probably not that dissimilar to Australia in many ways. Obviously we have a big contrast with the United States, which is very outwardly Christian, whereas our countries are very outwardly not Christian. We find ourselves in a situation where we as Seventh-day Adventists live in a subculture, which is not the real culture, particularly for those of us who grew up in an Adventist home. And because of that subculture, we have challenges when we go out to meet the person on the street and to share Jesus with them, because they have a different culture from us. Now, any time that you go into a mission field, anywhere where you go to a new area to start sharing Jesus with people, obviously one of the things that you need to learn to do is to learn to figure out, okay, what is this culture, and how can I, within the context of this culture, lead these people to Jesus? Moving into the Sydney CBD, we call it the CBD, Central Business District. In America they call it downtown. What do you call it here in England? CBD? That's good. Okay. We speak the same language. But moving into the CBD, I moved into an area of ministry that was very unlike any area that I'd worked in before, because it was just, everything is so much more extreme when you're in the centre of the city. You know, it's so much more extremely secular or extremely postmodern. You know, it's funny, it's kind of both at the same time. And so it took me some time just, you know, mixing with the people, meeting them on the street, meeting them within their homes, trying to get my head around where are these people coming from. You know, these are the kind of people that absolutely despise the suburbs. Anything that comes from the suburbs is like, ugh, imagine living out there in the suburbs. You know, that's just, and of course I lived out in the suburbs, but I actually lived out just a little bit, I live a little bit past the suburbs. I commute into the city every day. The one advantage that I had was that because I come from the bush, people could pretty much always tell that I come from the bush. And the really crazy thing is that in Australia, people in the city, they relate to the bush. Like, oh, the bush is good, you know, out in the country. I guess you'd call it the country. You know, the bush is good, but the suburbs, they want anything to do with the suburbs. If you come from the suburbs, you just, you know, you're one of these McDonald's kind of people. You know, that lives in a McDonald's kind of mansion. You know, they're all the same. You know, they all look the same. They taste the same. Everything's the same. That kind of thing. And so it took me some time to really get my head around where these people were coming from. But in so doing, it enabled me to. Working in that extreme environment gave me a lot of tools to be able to really reach out to secular and postmodern people. Typically, what we've done as Seventh-day Adventists is reach out to the easier people groups, particularly those that already have some kind of background in Christianity. Didn't really have any of that to work with when we started working in the centre of the city. The other thing that I've found is that we have largely, as Adventists, had three approaches to this kind of a culture. The first approach is those who simply ignore the culture. You know, and they say, okay, forget secular people, forget postmodern people. They're a hard people group or a hard culture to reach. And the theory goes along the lines of go where the fish are biting. Now, there is some truth to that, but at the same time, there is also truth to the reality that right within secular and postmodern culture, there are fish that are biting. There are people who are lost, people who need Jesus, and people that we need to reach out to and lead to Christ. And we can't afford to ignore that kind of people. It's a bit like saying, Catholics are hard to reach because we teach that they're the Antichrist, so let's ignore all Roman Catholics. We would really be in a lot of trouble if we did. And as Adventists in many countries, we have really perfected the art of being able to reach out to Roman Catholics. And you go to some, South American countries or somewhere like that where they're all Roman Catholics, and the Adventist church is booming because the local people there have studied into the culture, they understand what they're working with, and they have developed ways of being able to reach those people. One of the other approaches that the Adventist church has taken towards secular and postmodern culture is, rather than to ignore it, to become it. And that hasn't worked either. I've talked to quite a few people and they say, you've got to do this and you've got to do that, and they come up with all these strange ideas. We have to become secular and we have to become postmodern to reach this particular culture. Well, I've never seen anywhere where it works. If it was working, I think you might have an argument there. You might have a case to do so, but I haven't seen anywhere where it works. Another approach has been to simply deny that it exists and simply do everything the same as we've always done it before. The difficulty with that approach, of course, is that let's say you went to the Philippines and you denied that the Roman Catholic Church existed. And simply did your outreach in the Philippines exactly the same as you do it here in England. You're going to run into some trouble. You might get your head blown off. You have to be aware of what you are working with. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time just looking at some history as to where these different kinds of cultures have come from, why they are here, because when you understand where they came from, why they are here, it helps us to be able to understand how to relate to them, how to reach out to them. Now, this being a workshop, let me say if anybody's got any questions, I'm more than happy to answer questions. Put up your hand. Let's have some interaction happening. I've got a whole bunch of stuff here to talk about and to present. But please ask questions all the way along as we go. Okay, well, let's consider secularism for a moment. And I guess there's a lot of different ways that you could define secularism. When I'm talking about secular people, I'm talking about people who really have no belief. They don't consider themselves to have any kind of spiritual belief at all. They come from an atheist background or an atheist mindset, and generally speaking, they really don't care about those things that relate to God. You guys are a long way away back there. Oh, you got some other things to do. You see, these guys are multitasking. It's a good thing that they're young ladies. Ladies can multitask so much better than men. It's a good thing. Okay, the secular mindset is really an outgrowth of modernism. Now, the modern age began probably in the 1700s with the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And as Clifford was pointing out this morning, I found it very interesting listening to what Clifford was talking about, because this was an age where the whole scientific approach became became the thing, the thing to do. Everything was scientific, and you could study into it, and you could find out, knowledge came through your senses. What you could see, what you could feel, that was what was truth, and it was all about, proving what is truth. It was very mathematical. And so the whole mathematical thing, and of course during the Industrial Revolution, mathematics was at the centre of everything. As Clifford said this morning, if you're going to build a bridge, you're going to have a lot of mathematics that are involved in it. And there were all of these absolutes that came out of that. And of course, along with this came the Age of Reason. I'm sure you've probably all heard about the Age of Reason beginning with the Industrial Revolution. And once again, when it comes to the Age of Reason, we can't see God, can we? We can't feel God. You can't discover God in a scientific method. By proposing a theory and then going out and proving that theory is true and that it exists. And so, with the whole rise of modernism in the world, with the scientific mindset, with truth being what you can touch, what you can see, and what you can study through scientific methods, people had a major challenge with the concept of God, a challenge that had not been there during the medieval era. Does God really exist was a major question that was on a lot of people's minds. And this, of course, led to the rise of evolution, Charles Darwin. I think we have you guys here from England to blame for Charles Darwin. Of course, who came along and said, okay, we need to have a theory as to, we need to understand scientifically how this earth came into existence, how life came into existence, and it needs to be scientific-based rather than faith-based. And so Darwin came along with the theory of evolution. Now, I find it fascinating that Darwin sat down to write the book Origin of the Species in the year... Does anybody know what year he started to write that book? 1844. That's right, started to write it in 1844. And so this was also the time of the rise of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church responded very well to the environment that they found themselves in, because it was an environment that required proof. Logical, rock-solid proof for what people believed in. And one of the situations that arose early on in the Adventist Church, of course, when we study back through our church history, was the concept of doing outreach by debating. And some of our early evangelists, they'd go into a town, they would hire the public hall, and they would challenge all of the other ministers or whoever else it was there to a debate. And they'd debate on the subject of the Sabbath or the state of the dead or whatever else it might be, because as Seventh-day Adventists, we have a rock-solid message, we have a watertight message, and they knew that they could go into a debate like that and they would always win because the Bible is on our side. Now, of course, the debate didn't work, and Ellen White spoke very strongly against it. We have the example of people like Moses Hull, one of the most brilliant men that there was in the early Adventist church, who was a great debater, and he would go around and debate all over the place, and it was, it would really accomplish nothing, but it was a response to the culture in the world at that time. And Ellen White counselled him against it. One time he set up a debate with a spiritualist. Ellen White said, don't have anything to do with it, you're not wrestling against flesh and blood. He began to debate with the spiritualist, and as he was debating with the spiritualist, the arguments that the spiritualist was putting to him suddenly started to make sense. He became a spiritualist. You don't go and start a debate with the devil. It doesn't work. But that was one of the things that came out of that whole era. One of the things that didn't work, it's interesting that not everything the Adventist Church has done always works. When it comes to reaching secular and postmodern people, there are plenty of things out there that simply don't work. And when you're going to do outreach into these kind of people groups, you need to stop and ask yourself the question before you begin and before you grab the latest, greatest thing that has been put together for this particular people group. Is it actually working? Is there fruit from it? Because if there's no fruit, don't go and copy it. I've seen some lots of good theories put forward and lots of good ideas, and you look at it and think, I'm not sure whether that's going to work or not. And ministers have got up and said, you've got to do it this way and this way and this way and this way and this way. And you go to them and ask them, okay, how much of the, what are these methods accomplishing? How many churches are you planting? How many people are you baptizing? How many people are you winning to the Lord. And I have to tell you that with Fountain in the City, the church that we planted in downtown Sydney, and now the second one we've got in Marrickville, both of those churches were planted on the principle of kingdom growth, not of transfer growth. We started with 8 members that transferred in. That was it. And the rest has been kingdom growth, going out into the community and winning people for Jesus. The Seventh-day Adventist Church found that prophecy presented a very effective way of reaching out to the modern world because it provided evidence for what we believed in. And so you find that our evangelism has focused around prophecy. And I'm going to come back to it and deal with it in more detail, but exactly the same applies to postmodernism as well. I'm going to show you why. Okay, postmodernism, which by definition comes after the modern era, is a response to the failure of modernism. Now, I could spend quite a bit of time here this morning talking to you about how modernism has failed. But I think Clifford has done a far better job than I could ever dream of doing. When you consider that modernism has failed in that it has, we look at science, for instance, and when it comes to science, our science textbooks are constantly being rewritten. Every year they rewrite our textbooks. You know why? Because they find out... Sorry? Yeah, because they really don't know. And this year they found out that what they were teaching last year was wrong. And the thing that spins me out, particularly after listening to Clifford this morning, is that even when it comes to mathematics, and I thought that mathematics was one of those things that you have a formula, you work your way through the formula, and by the way, I could never understand it. It was beyond me. But you work your way through the formula and you come to a particular result at the end. Well, now I found out that that's not even the case. And scientific theories. We get all these scientific theories and we're told, okay, this theory and this theory and this theory, this is how it works. And this is truth because we've discovered it by scientific methods. But then we find that this theory contradicts this theory and this one wipes out that one and the two of them are mutually exclusive. And so what do? I find it fascinating. I don't know whether you have it here in England or not, but we have in Australia, the theory of evolution is on the decline. Because people know that it can't work. It's interesting at the school level, like primary school, high school, that kind of level, they still teach evolution. But once you go above that level, you have a lot of scientists in Australia who are avowed atheists, who no longer believe in evolution. Because they know, they're not silly, they know that it can't work. That does not mean that they are turning to God. And of course, with both modernism and postmodernism, there is an utter failure to meet the needs of the soul. And it leaves people cold and empty on the inside. It's interesting if we turn our Bibles to the book of Romans. Romans chapter 1. Yeah, let's start in verse 20. The Bible says, for the invisible things, that's Romans 1 and verse 20, for the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves wise, they became what? They became fools. And this is one of the reasons we have the rise of postmodernism, is because they professed themselves to be wise, and in professing themselves to be wise, the wiser they got, the more foolish they got. The more they learned, the more they realized how little they actually knew. And yet they did not turn to God. The interesting thing with postmodernism people is I meet people who are and working in the area that I'm working. You can knock on one door and you'll find a secular person. You knock on the next door and you find a postmodern person. And the difference between the two is the secular person who takes a very scientific approach to everything. Okay? He cannot believe in the existence of God because he doesn't have scientific basis for it. You come to the postmodern person who's living next door to him, and he can't prove that there's God either, but he's not so concerned whether you can prove there is God or whether you can't prove there is God. He's concerned with what he can experience. And both of them might be highly educated people with multiple degrees after their name. And you come to a postmodern person and he considers himself to be very spiritual. Very much into spirituality. And he'll read his horoscope and go to the palm reader and read Da Vinci Code and believe that it's true and all kinds of things that we would consider to be way out there and kind of wacky, and it's like you can't prove it. But he's not interested whether you can prove it or not. He's just interested in experiencing it. And so you have a contrast between these two people groups, and you have a mixture between the two. And basically what you have on the one side is reason. On the other side you have myth. And what we have seen is with the collapse of reason, we have had the rise of myth as to how people understand the world. But with the collapse of reason and the rise of myth, both still coexist, and they're held in tension with each other. The fascinating thing is the one thing that they don't recognise is that there is a third alternative, and that, of course, is revelation. In other words, what God reveals. I'm not talking about the book of Revelation, even though that's included in it, but revelation, what God reveals in His Word. And that's the alternative that as Christians we can put forward. It's interesting to notice how mainstream churches today have responded to the whole postmodern thing. Benedict a couple of years ago was in Sydney. Big program. Lots and lots of people came from all over the world. There's more people turned up for Benedict than turned up for the Olympics. Which tells you something when you understand a few things about Revelation 13, right? All the world will wander after the beast. I think there was 4 times the level of security for Benedict than there was for George Bush when he came out. And it was pretty crazy. But be that as may, Benedict was there, and one of the things that Benedict did was that he brought with him a whole heap of relics. Now, relics in the Western society have been something that has been considered to be a relic of the medieval ages, right? When it comes to somebody whose standpoint is reason, someone's coming from the area of reason, a scientific approach, how much credibility are you going to give to going and touching some dead saint's bones? You don't give any credibility to something like that. You think these guys are loony. And so for a long time, of course, in the Western world, relics have been irrelevant. They haven't really been important at all. Somewhat in third world countries, they've still retained some level of importance. Well, Benedict turns up and he's got brings all of these relics to Australia. And all of the Aussies, right? Aussies like me, who come from a secular background, a non-religious background, they're all going along like, oh wow, venerating these relics. So we have this rise of myth as a foundation within our culture, which creates all kinds of opportunities for us as Adventists. Then, of course, on the other hand, you have the charismatic churches. In Sydney, we have our local mega church is a place called Hillsong. Do you ever hear of Hillsong out here? Okay, yeah, it's kind of okay, all right, yeah, I understand it. Yeah, well, Hillsong is a charismatic church, and so often in my evangelistic meetings, people will come along who go to Hillsong. They've got about like 15,000 members or something or other, and so when you do a campaign in their backyard, you know that you're going to have a lot of Hillsongers there. And I never forget one time I was presenting a passage from 1 John chapter 4 where it says, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." And these Hillsongers came to me after the meeting and they were absolutely horrified that I would read this passage of the Bible. They said, no, you should never do that. Never test the spirit. I'm thinking, wow, this is interesting. Why not test the spirit? Because if you're testing the spirit, It's showing a lack of faith. Just accept what the Spirit is doing. Experience it for yourself. I was thinking, wow, these guys have set themselves up to receive the mark of the beast, haven't they? You know, it's frightening, absolutely frightening. But it's a good expression of postmodernism, where experience is everything. What you experience is what is truth. In modernism, what you can discover through science is proof. In postmodernism, what you can experience is truth, and therefore every person's experience is different. Therefore, truth is different for every person. Daniel.
I was talking with a physio colleague. He's been to the Philippines, been to all different things, and doesn't believe that he wants proof that God is God.
Yes.
I said, no, he is.
Yes.
He says, then he started going down, like, how do you get rid of sexual thoughts out of your mind, and these sort of things. But all his thing was like experience.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like, how do, well, that's interesting, you've got that experience, but that doesn't make it true.
Yeah, oh yeah,
so
absolutely.
How do you then,
Yep.
I suppose, win? Because I ended up giving Mark, the little book of Mark, said, read the scriptures, learn for yourself, and read for yourself. Yeah. That there is an absolute truth. So
and we're going to look at in the second half of this workshop. I'm going to look at the how-tos. Just building a foundation here, so that because we live in a subculture, we often don't understand where a lot of people around us are coming from, and so it's good for us to stop for a moment and consider and understand where are a lot of these people coming from. Yes.
Little Mormons, they also are very postmodern.
Yeah, that's true. That's interesting. Yeah.
They came to our house and they were studying for a bit.
Uh-huh.
So I was thinking, I can convince them or something. But they were saying, read this.
And do you feel the fire burning within you or something? Yeah. Yeah.
If it feels right, then it must be right.
Yeah.
They must get loads of people that way.
Well, you wonder. I mean, when you look at the Mormon message, there's no message there. These guys have nothing. Nothing. And you think, how on earth do they ever... It's beyond me. But anyway, I think that's probably... Yes?
I have something.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm missing all these hands that are going up.
The issue of the Mormons, how do they actually manage to do it, is because they have community.
Yes.
And part of what they've realised is that in that secular society where community was broken down through that,
That's right.
the age of reason, is what they did was build a foundation of community. So if you're a single parent family and you go into that environment, they will assign you a surrogate grandparent, so there's always a male role model around. If you're going in as a single person, they will assign you somebody who's going to mentor you.
Yeah.
And so they've built up a huge network. So there might not be a theological message, although there is, but it's dodgy.
Yeah. There's not much there.
It's a little dodgy. But what they have done is capitalised on what community is about, what the message is about. If you were hungry, they would come and bring you food.
Yeah.
If you needed clothes, they would make sure there's donations. There's all those sorts of things that they've capitalised on, those community elements that have been broken down to secularism, and postmodernism has capitalised on to a certain degree.
Indeed. Matt?
I was going to say just a few things.
Oh, we've got good lessons to learn from that too, by the way, but yeah.
And I hope that I'll say it, what I'm thinking. Sometimes what you say and what you think is different. But it seems to me, perhaps, and this is a comment, and anyone can feel free to comment, I guess, but that like the scientific community at large and the culture at large, or the faith-based belief system, is really the only logical one. It's the only sensible one at the end of the day, when all is said and done. Because
it's interesting how that is the logical conclusion, that there's a place where you can never go.
Yeah.
And secular and postmodern people will often realise that. Now, that's where God comes into the picture, but that's where they don't want to put God, and so then they have the unknown God. You find in the book of Acts. Yeah.
Can I just add to that point a bit? There was a show recently done by the BBC, which is the British broadcasting thing for the UK, and they did a show.
Yeah, we have BBC in Australia.
Yeah. They did a show called "Did Darwin Kill God?"
Yep.
It's just that. It's a belief, it's an interpretation of the facts, which requires faith. And so sometimes when I'm dealing with someone who's scientific, I try to help them see how unscientific they really are in their belief system. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Because the scientific community, with all of its pride and human, really sickening arrogance, like tries to set itself up on a pedestal as if what we believe is verifiable. What you believe, it's cute, it's trite, they try to belittle the faith aspect of religion. But they hide, they sweep under the carpet their own faith aspect, and in a closed door conversation, they'll all admit it to each other.
Okay, having discussed some of the history, I guess, of where modernism and postmodernism and secularism has come from in modern history, what I want to look at is a biblical basis for what we actually do in evangelism, in reaching out to this kind of a community. And in doing so, let me ask you all a question. What was the culture of the world at the time of the writing of the book of Acts? It was Greek. Who was ruling the world? Rome. Rome was ruling the world, but Greek was the culture of the world. You know how it is when you speak English, you can go pretty much anywhere in the world, and you'll find people you can communicate with, right? Back then, if you wanted to go anywhere in the world and communicate with people, you had to be able to speak Greek. Why was it that Greek culture was the culture under the Roman Empire? The Romans didn't have much culture. You studied into their history. They didn't have as much culture as the Greeks did. And of course, the Greeks, under Alexander the Great and then his successors, had, the Greek culture had permeated right throughout the whole world. Greek culture is divided into probably three main areas. The first was the mythological era, which began, and it's important for us. There's an important reason why I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at Greek culture. I'm going to come to it in a little while, but just bear with me as we work our way through it. Basically, the mythological era was previous to the New Testament era by a long time, and the Greeks during that era were just simply rank pagans. Simple as that. Then you move on to the classical period, where you have the rise of the philosophers. Now, during the classical period and the rise of the philosophers, this is still previous to New Testament times when it all started to take place, you had a movement away from rank paganism, because now you had the philosophers who were asking all these questions. How do we know that there is? How do we know that the gods exist, and all this kind of stuff? And it's interesting when you come to Socrates. Socrates, his whole basis of how you understand yourself is that you must know yourself and you must be true to yourself. Now, it's one thing that I can find when I go out into the community, I knock on doors, I meet people in the community. Doesn't matter whether it's secular or postmodern, they're always going to come to me with this concept: you must be true to yourself. And in that statement, I find a statement that illustrates a position that is the exact opposite of Christianity. And this is where Christianity is different from every other religion on the face of the planet. You can look at every other religion. I've got a slide here somewhere, illustrating it, contrasting two different systems. And I borrowed this off another slideshow that I was doing on the ancient Babylonian mystery religions. But basically, the Babylonian Egyptian mystery religions contrasted with primitive Judeo-Christian spirituality. On this side, you've got being God within yourself. Okay? On this side over here, you've got dying to self to live for God. So for the Christian, the last thing in the world you ever want to be is true to yourself. Because the Bible says that the human heart is desperately wicked and evil above all things. So if you're true to yourself, you're going to be desperately wicked and evil above all things, right? As a Christian, we aim to die to self. You have the answers are within, the answers are without. You have the power is in the created, the power is in the creator. You've got rituals and icons and all this kind of stuff happening over here. Relationship with God. Relationship with the divine. Of course, this one, interestingly, leads to global control. I want you to think about that at the moment, because that's the kind of world we live in, isn't it? A global world. If you are God within yourself, you are God, and the power is within you, then the natural conclusion is for you to be God over the world and to control the whole world. And then, of course, the contrast over here is service to others rather than global control. You know, just looking back once again, you got these Greek philosophers, you got Plato, who believed that knowledge that was gained through the senses was impure. He says knowledge had to be gained from within your mind. You had to go within yourself, tap into the God within you. That truth was not sensory, but was intellectual and deductive. Now, Plato rejected myth. That was a pretty bold thing for him to do, because Greek culture, particularly the pagan culture, was founded on their myths. You know, the Greek myths were so embedded into the Greek mindset that we still know about them today. But he rejected the myths. He said that the myths were all there as allegories to teach spiritual lessons, and he created some myths of his own. You know, some allegorical myths of his own to teach truth and to be applicable. It's interesting that when you put those two things together, you have pure reason, you know, reasoning within your mind, combined with myth, which is pretty much exactly what we find in our world today. We have reason and we have myth, and people will have either one or the other or both together, but they won't have anything to do with revelation, what God has revealed. Became an intellectual mythology. Aristotle came along after Plato, and he taught the exact opposite, that knowledge came from experience. And if you could experience it, then it was truth. He, of course, promoted the idea of natural selection. Now, while we might all blame you British for Darwin simply copied the Greeks when he put together his theory of natural selection. The Greeks, of course, depending on which Greek philosophers you were really dealing with, but during the whole concept of natural selection, I'll come to in a bit more detail in just a moment, was definitely a Greek era. Then you come to the Hellenistic period, where mythology took on the prestige of elite knowledge that marked its possessors as belonging to a certain class. And so now what you had was the upper class, and in the upper class you had reason and you had myth. You had a myth that was connected to reason. And in the lower class, of course, you still had paganism. Skepticism, of course, became more pronounced, and you had the different philosophers. You know, you'd had some that would be over here on the side of reason and some that would be over here on the side of myth, and there was this whole tension between the two. And basically what was taking place was that the society was almost identical to the postmodern and secular society that we find ourselves in today. In fact, the more you study into Greek philosophy, it's simply a commentary on Western society today. The Stoics believed that the gods were a physical phenomena, not supernatural, but they were like us. The Euhemerists, or however you pronounce that, believed that gods were historical figures who had been romanticised. Varro believed that religion as a human institution that had great importance for the preservation of good in society. Now, we have all of these same kind of concepts going around today. Nothing's changed within secular and postmodern society. It's interesting that, of course, with the Romans, they didn't have any great mythology of their own, and so they simply used the Greek system. But the Romans did something very interesting, was because that they recognised within the pagan religions of the world, which were simply a more superstitious version of exactly the same thing. You know, because you've got your philosophers who might not necessarily believe in the existence of gods, but they taught exactly the same principles of your peasants who did believe in the existence of the gods. Okay, the Romans they created this great multi-denominational system where they blended everything together. They found that everybody had a few things in common. They all worshipped the Queen of Heaven. They all worshipped on Sunday, and so they licensed all these different religions around the world. And Christianity, of course, was the first great major threat to that system that came along. when you look at the Greek theories of origins, the Greeks believed that life had evolved from a mixture, from mud, a mixture of warmth and water, began with aquatic creatures that became humans. You know, some people think that Darwin came up with this stuff. Darwin didn't come up with this stuff. He copied it from the Greeks. Then, of course, on the other side, you've got those Greeks who believe that life originated with human characteristics, and therefore humans could be gods. And then you had some Greeks who believed in evolution, and some Greeks who believed in intelligent design. And there was a great debate in the Greek world between evolution and intelligent design, going backwards and forwards between the philosophers. We've got exactly the same thing happening today. If you look at the whole concept of natural selection within the Greek world, and you take the Spartans, for instance, who took it to great extremes. You know, when a Spartan child was born, if it was a male child, and if it was any kind of child, it was placed on the doorstep of the home, and it was left there until the next day, and if it was still alive, they would keep that child. You know, natural selection, survival of the fittest. They were trying to build a super race. And then, of course, the young men would be trained to fight to the death from when they were just little kids. Why? They were trying to build a super race, weed out the weakest. You wonder where football was invented. You know that? It was invented by the Spartans. You know, they get this big rock, and they had two teams, and you had to get that rock from one side of the field to the other. And the idea was to kill the opposite team. That was the purpose of it. And wipe out the weakest. Alexander the Great. Of course, when Alexander the Great was on his deathbed, he did not give the Greek empire to his sons, did he? What did he say? The kingdom shall go to the strongest. Why? Natural selection, survival of the fittest. He was trying to build an empire that would last forever. And so what you find is this. The Greek world and the Greek culture was both postmodern and secular at the same time. It was based on reason and myth at the same time. And it is a commentary on the society that we live in today. It was almost identical. Now, within that culture, you have the story of the book of Acts. And what took place in the book of Acts? Christianity took the world by storm. And you know, what I find just amazing is when all these people, they come to me and I've been to some of the meetings and whatnot that have been held, and particularly because of where I'm working, people, they involve me in all these discussions on postmodern and secular people, and it's always how hard they are to reach. I'm thinking, if they are so hard to reach, then how was it that Christianity exploded in the Greek world, which is exactly the same as the world that we are in today? So we need to consider a few things about the world in which we live. It's interesting when it comes to you can go out and I was asked to send over a bibliography and make a recommendation of books to read on this subject before I came over here, and I didn't because I couldn't find any. There are a bunch of books out there on postmodern stuff, and there's a bunch of books out there on reaching postmodern people, and you've never read so much drivel and rubbish in all your life. Sorry for being blunt. I'm saying within Christianity in general. And so I had a real challenge with it. My experience with reaching postmodern and secular people has come from meeting them on the street, spending time in their homes, sharing Jesus with them, leading them to Christ. And I've learned some things from that I'm going to share. I put together a little bit of a list here. It's not in any particular order, and it's not how should I describe it? An exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. But these were just some of the observations I made from the people that I was working with. So one of the things I found was that people in the centre of the city are very environmentally conscious. We go letterboxing, putting lead cards in people's letterboxes. And man, that time is getting away. We go putting things in people's letterboxes, and of course, we have these no junk mail stickers. You do that here in England? They don't do that in America. You're not allowed to. But in England, you've got the same. You go and put in, you go some places, some of the suburbs around Sydney, and 50% of the mailboxes have got a no junk mail sticker. But they're not just the ordinary no junk mail stickers. They're green ones. You know, because it's the Greenpeace or the Green Party or green this, green that, green whatever. So you find people who are incredibly environmentally conscious. These are people who are health conscious, but because they generally detest anything that's mainstream. They're not interested in the mainstream. They're always looking for alternatives. And so not the kind of people that you'd ever tell them about Sydney Adventist Hospital, because it's just, not where they're at. When I started working there, I stopped for lunch one time. There's a little restaurant called NECyouth. And I've gone into this restaurant. It's good food. But anyway, this food, it's 100% vegan, and it's gluten-free, oil-free, this free, that free, the other free, every kind of free that you can imagine. It comes in a little brown recyclable paper bag with the wise sayings of Bhagwan Swami somebody or other on the outside of it, right? So I've gone into this place and I'm thinking, man, this is pretty extreme. You know, anywhere at all you can get a big vegetarian menu. But this place, I'm thinking, these guys are out there. You know, they're extreme. I'm thinking, I wonder how well they actually do, you know. Do they actually get a lot of business here? Come to find, there was 5 franchises from all around Sydney. They were roaring along. So you've got people that are unbelievably health conscious, and they're looking for anything that is alternative. They're into quality over quantity. People that live in the city, you know, they live in these little itty-bitty houses, or apartments, I should say. Very few houses, but little itty-bitty apartments. Not much stuff in it, but what they have 1 or 2 things that are very high quality. You go out into the suburbs, they have big houses and big yards with lots of stuff that was all made in China. Bit of a contrast. Detest anything that's mainstream. You know, they're the kind of people that they look at, your old school churches like your Anglican church, your Uniting Church, which in Australia is Presbyterian, Methodist and Congregationalist combined. Your old school churches, as they see them as being relevant as a community service. You know, they do good things in the community, that's about it. On the other hand, you've got your local megachurch such as Hillsong, which they see as being full of weak-minded people who have been conned by American-style TV evangelists. Sorry, Matt. But seriously, that's how they look at Christianity. You know, it's going to either fall into this category or that category, and so they don't want to have anything to do with mainstream. They, generally speaking, they consider themselves to be spiritual people. They are into spirituality, but not into religion. They have a sense of myth and mystery. At the same time, we have something interesting that has taken place, and that is the rise and the mainstreaming of conspiracies. Because in postmodernism, you don't need proof, right? You don't need proof. These are the kind of people, they read the Da Vinci Code and believe it's true. Seriously. Highly educated. Unbelievable. It's fascinating. Amazing. Of course, relationships are vital. They're more interested in relationships than good information. You know, a modern person with a scientific mindset is looking for good information. A postmodern person is looking for something they can experience, a relationship. Another thing that I found is that they like to blame Christians for war. Thought that was interesting. Cropped up quite a few times, so I added it to the list. Another one that I put in here, they see Christianity as being somewhat of a blind faith. You know, we believe because we believe because we believe because we believe, you know. So those were some of the things that I found working in the city. You know, when you compare it with the Greek world, there's one more on there? No, that's it. Let me go to Romans chapter 1 and verse 25. Was the Greek world interested in the environment? Romans chapter 1, verse 25, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the what? The creature more than what? The Creator. So they were worshipping the created. So there's definitely, whoops, what? Oh, it's gone. Oh, now that's That's not nice. They've cut me off. They said time's up and they've taken my slides away. There, they're back again. All right. I guess I have to finish up. I'll just run through this very quickly. And what I'm going to do is make a comparison between current culture in Sydney at the moment and Greek culture at the time of the writing of the New Testament. And then I'm going to make some comparisons when we come back with where we are as Seventh-day Adventists. Okay. Health conscious. You ever heard of Pergamos? The Asclepian? If you go to Pergamos, a huge healing centre there. And Pergamos was interesting because they combined two different kinds of healing together. They combined New Age healing and drug medication. It was the origin of drug medication, but they also had these big long tunnels where you go down through the tunnel and people would speak spells down onto you as you're walking through the tunnel and all this kind of stuff. So you had this reason and myth together. I'm nearly finished, Lyndon. I'm just... Okay, no worries. All right, he's smiling. That's good. Actually, I might go by that. Have I got until past by that clock? Oh, okay. All right. Quality over quantity. You only have to look at the archaeological remains of the Greek culture to know that these guys were into, they were perfectionists when it came to the quality of the stuff that they produced, particularly in art. They were very visually attuned. Postmodern people today are exactly the same. They're very visually attuned to the world in which they live, particularly when it comes to art. They were not mainstream. When you read the Greek philosophers, they were definitely, mainstream was the pagan Greeks. They weren't mainstream. They were anything but mainstream. It's interesting that if we go to Acts chapter 17, let's go over there real quick. Acts chapter 17. And here we have the story of Paul when he went to Athens. Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 19, it says, "And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine whereof you speak is. For you bring certain strange things to our ears. We would know therefore what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers which were there, which there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear something new." They weren't there to hear and to tell the old mainstream stuff. They were only interested in something new, something that was not mainstream, and that's why they wanted to hear what Paul had to say. Okay, were they spiritual? Absolutely they were spiritual. But they weren't religious. Definitely very spiritual, but definitely not religion. Religion was something for the peasants. Philosophy was for the educated. I got the wrong slides here. Oops, now they've all gone. Don't you hate it when that happens? Okay, let me just run down through this very quickly. I think it works all right up until here. Okay, the Greeks. Did the Greeks have a sense of myth and mystery and conspiracies and all that kind of stuff? Absolutely they did. It's interesting that they did not require truth, but they required interpretation. If we go to Acts chapter 17 and verse 32, it says, "And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked and others says, We will hear you again on this matter." You see, the resurrection of the dead was something that you couldn't prove, and so it became a stumbling block for them. If we work our way down through the list, when it came down to Christianity, it's interesting what took place because Christians weren't blamed for war during that time period. But as Christianity grew and it became such a threat to their very existence, Christianity got blamed for all the natural disasters that took place. Anytime a natural disaster came along, got blamed on the Christians, and they saw Christians as having somewhat of a blind faith because they believed in the concept of the resurrection. And so what you find is that there is a parallel between Greek culture in the time of the New Testament and our culture right now. And so on that basis, when we read the book of Acts, there has never been an era in the history of the world since this book was first written where this book has been more relevant than right now. Because this book outlines for us how The early church took the world by storm in the culture in which we live. The book of Acts was not as relevant 50 years ago as what it is right now. You go to the medieval ages and it was very unrelevant. I mean, it wasn't unrelevant, don't get me wrong, but nothing like as relevant as what it is right now. And the other thing it tells me, of course, is that, hey, if it's heading back to the time, culture is heading back to the time that it was when Jesus was on earth, it's time for him to come back again, isn't it? Praise the Lord. We need to finish up. Let's bow our heads and we'll finish with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the time we've been able to spend together. We pray that you will bless us as we continue on with our workshop in 10 minutes' time. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.